Hi, sixth grade. It's Mr. Gilbert here, and I'm here to read for you chapter 3 of To the True Confessions of Charlotte Doyle. I wanted to take this opportunity to use this read aloud video to show you, just in case you forgot, how to access an online version of the book in case you forgot your copy. Maybe you switched locations, maybe you're at a different house, or maybe you left it in someone's car and you don't have it right away. If you have your computer, you have the option to read online in case you forget your book. The expectation is to read with your book, but just in case, as a backup, as a second option, you have the ability to access it on our ELA resource website. So right now I'm in BC's Google Classroom, but if you are in any of the other advisories, it's the same to find it. So if it's not in your ELA tab, it'll be under the resources tab, and it'll be marked ELA resource website. And you can click on it. And if you're signed in, it'll take you to this page. So you can see that we are reading True Confessions of Charlotte Doyle. But if you come up to the chapters tab at the top, there's a section for PDF copies, chapter 1, chapter 2. So chapter 3 will be posted up here. But for right now, I'm going to use my copy, just right here. So we're going to be reading aloud chapter 3. So make sure you open up your books to page, sorry, not the page, open up to chapter 3, which will be the first line. We'll start with, I awoke the next morning in my narrow bed. So let's get to it. I awoke the next morning in my narrow bed, fully clothed, and a stark truth came to me. I was where no proper young lady should be. I needed only to close my eyes again to hear my father use those very words. But as I lay there, feeling the same tossing motion I'd felt when falling asleep, I took it to be that of a ship moored to the dock. I recollected Mr. Grummage saying that the Seahawk was due to leave by the first morning's tide. It was not too late. I would ask to be put ashore, and in some fashion, I hardly cared how, I'd make my way back to the Barrington School. There, with Miss Weed, I would be safe. She would make the necessary decisions. Having composed my mind, I sat up with some energy to strike my head upon the low ceiling. Chastened, I got myself to the cabin floor. Now I discovered that my legs had become so weak, so rubbery, I all but sank to my knees. Still, my desperation was such that nothing could stop me. Holding on to now one part of the wall, now another, I made my way out of the cabin, into the dim, close steerage, and up to the steps to the waist of the ship, only to receive the shock of my life. So we have really good examples here of author's craft where Charlotte is expressing all of her thoughts. So the author, Avi, is doing a really good job of telling the reader what's going through Charlotte's mind as she is waking up and exploring the ship. Everywhere I looked, great canvas sails of gray from mainsail to main royal, from flying jib to trysail, were bellied out. Beyond the sails stretched the sky itself, as blue as a baby's bluest eyes, while the greenish sea, crowned with lacy caps of foaming white, rushed by with unrelenting speed. The Seahawk had gone to sea. We must have left Liverpool hours before. As this realization took hold, the Seahawk, almost as if wishing to offer final proof, pitched and rolled. Nausea choked me. My head pounded. Weaker than ever, I turned around in search of support. For a fleeting but horrible second, I had this notion that I was alone on board. Then I realized that I was being watched with crude curiosity. Standing on the quarterdeck was a red-faced man whose slight stoop and powerful broad shoulders conspired to give the impression of perpetual suspicion, an effect heightened by the dark, deep-set eyes partially obscured by craggy eyebrows. "Sir," I called weakly, "where are we?" "We're coasting down the Irish Sea, Miss Doyle," replied the man in his raspy voice. I I shouldn't be here," I managed. But the man, seemingly indifferent to my words, only turned with a slab of a hand reached for a bell set up at the head of the quarterdeck in a kind of gallows. He pulled the clapper 3 times. Even as I tried to keep myself from sinking to the deck, 9 men suddenly appeared in the ship's waist, from above as well as below, fore as well as aft. All wore distinctive sailor's garb of canvas breeches and shirts. So we're getting some really good description now of the men on the ship who are sailors. And Charlotte is slowly piecing together where she is in her setting. She's no longer in Liverpool. She's no longer at the docks. She's in the open sea, as you can see behind me. A few had no shoes at all. 1 or 2 wore tar-covered hats, others caps of red cloth. 2 had beards. 1 man had long hair and a ring in his left ear. Their faces were dark from sun and tar. They were, in all, as sorry a group of men I had ever seen. Glum in expression, defeated in posture, with no character in any eye save sullenness. They were like men recruited from the doormat of hell. I did recognize the sailor who had given me the warning the night before, but he paid no attention to me. And when I looked for the man who called himself Zachariah, I finally found him peering out from beneath the forecastle deck, no more concerned with me than the others. They were all looking elsewhere. I shifted to follow their gaze. The broad-shouldered man had been joined by another. Just to see him made my heart leap joyously with recognition and relief. It's a really good example of how Charlotte is feeling in this moment, from scared and confused to finally recognition and feeling relieved. Let's see why she feels relieved. From his fine coat, from his tall beaver hat, from his glossy black boots, from his clean, chiseled countenance, from the dignified way he carried himself, I knew at once, without having to be told, that this must be Captain Jaggery. And he, I saw in the glance, was a gentleman, the kind of man I was used to, a man to be trusted. In short, a man to whom I could talk and upon whom I could rely. But before I composed myself to approach, Captain Jaggery turned to the man who had rung the bell, and I heard him say, "Mr. Hollybrass, we are short 1." Mr. Hollybrass, I was soon to discover that he was the first mate, looked scornfully at the assembled men below. Then he said, "The second mate did best he could, sir. No one else could be got to sign articles. Not for anything." The captain frowned. Then he said, "The others will have to take up the slack. I'll not have any less. Have the men give their names." Hollybrass nodded curtly and then took a step forward and addressed the assembled crew. "Give your names," he barked. One by one, the sailors shuffled forward a step, lifted their heads, doffed their caps, and spoke their names, but slumped into broken postures once again, once they returned to the line. Dillingham, Grimes, Morgan, Barlow, Foley, Ewing, Fisk, Johnson, Zachariah. When they had done, Hollybrass said, "Your crew, Captain Jaggery." At first, the captain said nothing. He merely studied the men with a look of contempt and an attitude that, because I shared it, made me respect him even more. "Who is the second mate?" I heard him ask. "Mr. Keach, sir. He's at the wheel." "Ah, yes," the captain returned. "Mr. Keach. I might have guessed." He studied the line of sailors, smiled sardonically, and said, "But where, then, is Mr. Cranach?" "Sir?" Hollybrass said, clearly puzzled. "Cranach. I don't know the name, sir." "Now, there's an unlooked-for blessing," the captain said, his manners none the less courtly. All this was said loudly enough for the crew and me to hear. Captain Jaggery now took a step forward. "Well, then," he said in a clear, firm voice, "it's a pleasure to see you all again. I take it kindly that you've signed on with me. Indeed, I suspect we know each other well enough so that each understands what's due to the other. That makes it easy." His confident tone was tonic to me. I felt myself gain strength. "I have no desire to speak to any of you again," the captain continued. "Mr. Hollybrass here, as first mate, shall be my voice. So too Mr. Keach as second mate. Separation makes for an honest crew. An honest crew makes a fair voyage. A fair voyage brings profit, and profit, my good gentlemen, doth turn the world. But," Jaggery continued, his voice rising with the wind, "I give warning." He leaned forward over the rail, much as I'd seen teachers lean toward unruly students. "If you give me less, one finger less, than the particulars of the articles that you have signed, I shall take my due. Make no mistake, I will. You know what I mean when I say, don't you? No, we shall have no democracy here, no parliaments, no congressmen. There's but one master on this ship, and that is me." So he turned to the first mate. "Mr. Hollybrass?" "Sir?" "An extra issue of rum, as a gesture of goodwill towards a pleasant, quick passage. Let it be understood that I know the old saying, no ship sails the same sea twice." "Very good, sir. You may dismiss them," the captain said. "Dismissed," echoed the first mate. For a moment, no one moved. The captain continued to look steadily at the men, then slowly, then with great deliberation. But then he turned his back upon them. "Dismissed," Hollybrass said again. After the crew had gone, he murmured some words to Captain Jaggery. The two shook hands, and the first mate went below. Now the captain was alone on the quarterdeck. Glancing upward at the sails from time to time, he began to pace back and forth, almost in leisurely fashion, hands clasped behind his back, a study in deep thought. I, meanwhile, still clung to the rail, braced against the heaving ship, but I had new hope. I had not been abandoned. My perception of Captain Jaggery made me certain that my world was regained. Summoning such strength and courage as was left me, I mounted the steps to the quarterdeck. When I reached the top, the captain was moving away from me. Grateful for the momentary reprieve, I stood where I was, fighting the nausea that I felt, gathering all of my womanly arts so as to present myself in the most agreeable fashion, making sure my hair, my best asset, fell just so, despite the breeze, to my lower back. At last he turned. For a moment, his severe eyes rested on me, and then he smiled. It was such a kind, good natured smile that my heart nearly melted. I felt I would, I think I did, shed tears of gratitude. Ah, he said with unimpeachable refinement, Miss Doyle, our young lady passenger. He lifted his tall hat in formal salutation. Captain Andrew Jaggery, at your service. He bowed. Please, sir, I whispered in my most modest ladylike way. My father would not want me here on this ship and in this company. I must go back to Liverpool, to Miss Weed. Captain Jaggery smiled brilliantly and then laughed, a beguiling, manly laugh. Return to Liverpool, Miss Doyle, he said, out of the question. Time, as they say, is money. And nowhere is this truer than on board a ship. We are well off and we shall continue on. God willing, we shall touch no land but welcome ports. I'm sorry you have such rude company. I know you are used to better. It could not be helped. But in a month, no more than 2, we shall have you safe in Providence, no worse off but for a little salt in that pretty hair of yours. In the meanwhile, I promise you that when you're well, for I can see by your pallor that you have a touch of seasickness, I'll have you in my quarters for tea. We shall be friends, you and I. Sir, I shouldn't be here. Miss Doyle, you have my word, no harm shall come your way. Besides, it said a pretty child, a pretty woman, keeps the crew in a civilized state, and this crew can do with some of that. I feel so ill, sir. That's to be expected, Miss Doyle. In a few days it will pass. Now, will you excuse me? Duty calls. Turning, he made his way to the stem where the second mate stood at the wheel. Checked by his courteous but complete dismissal of my request and feeling even weaker than before, I somehow made it back to my cabin. I did manage to crawl into the bed, and once there, I must have fallen to some kind of swoon. In any case, I remained there, too ill, too weak to do anything, certain I'd never rise again. Now and again, I would feel a rough skinned but a gentle hand beneath my head. I would open my eyes, and there was Zachariah's ancient black face close by, murmuring soft, comforting sounds, spooning warm gruel or tea into my mouth. I didn't know which, as if I were some baby. Indeed, I was a baby. And from time to time, the face of Captain Jaggery loomed large too, a welcome and tender gift of sympathy. Indeed, I believed it was the sight of him more than anything else that sustained me. For I suffered a real and terrible stomach pains and dreadful headaches. Even my dreams were haunted by ghastly visions. So real were they that once I started up and found Zachariah's dirk in my hand. I must have plucked it from beneath my mattress and was brandishing against some imagined evil. I heard a sound. I looked across the cabin. A rat was sitting on my journal, nibbling at its spine, horrified. I flung the dirk at it, then buried my head in the coverlet, burst into tears, and cried myself to sleep again. This bad time passed. At length, I was able to sleep in peace. How long I slept, I am not sure, but then at last, I truly awoke. And that was chapter 3.